She walked into that ballroom with nothing but an emerald dress and her dignity. She left soaked in red wine, humiliated in front of 500 people, laughed at, mocked, and thrown out like she didn't belong in the same room as them. They thought that was the end of her story. They had no idea the most dangerous man in America was watching from above, and that the woman they just destroyed was the only person he had ever considered worth protecting. Before this night is over, everything changes. For all of them. If you've never seen money, cruelty, and one woman's unbreakable spirit collide in the same room, stay with me until the very end. Subscribe to this channel right now because the stories I tell here don't just entertain. They'll remind you what real strength looks like. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to know exactly how far this story has traveled. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next in that ballroom will shake you to your core. The invitation had been sitting on Naomi Brooks's kitchen table for 11 days before she touched it. It arrived in a cream-colored envelope, thick paper, gold lettering, the kind of stationery that smelled like old money even through the mail slot. The Holloway Foundation's annual charity gala. Black tie. Riverside Plaza Hotel. 8 o'clock. Her name had been printed with a precision that felt almost accusatory, like whoever sent it wanted to make sure she understood this was not a mistake, not a misprint, not a courtesy extension to someone beneath the event's caliber. She had turned it face down for 11 days. Naomi was 28 years old and had grown up on the south side of Chicago in a neighborhood where the word gala existed in an entirely different universe, a universe she had watched through television screens and magazine covers at the dentist's office, a universe that had nothing to do with cracked sidewalks and triple-locked doors and the particular silence that falls over a block when someone's been shot 3 streets over and everyone just goes back inside. She had clawed her way out of that silence, not elegantly, not without scars. Her mother had worked 2 jobs until her knees gave out and then worked 1 job in pain. Her father had been gone by the time Naomi turned 6, not dead, just absent, which was a different kind of grief because it left questions instead of answers. She'd graduated high school on a combination of stubbornness and a guidance counselor who saw something in her essay about wanting to build something that lasted. She'd gotten a partial scholarship to DePaul, worked nights at a call center, graduated with a degree in nonprofit management and $34,000 in debt that still sat in her chest like a stone she'd learned to breathe around. At 24, she'd launched Rise, Resilience, Independence, Strength, Empowerment, a nonprofit that mentored girls between the ages of 12 and 18 in Chicago's most underserved neighborhoods. Not girls who were already succeeding, girls who were falling, girls who had been told in 100 different ways by 100 different systems that their falling was inevitable. By 28, Rise had served over 3,000 young women. Naomi had done it without a trust fund, without family connections, without any of the things the people inside that gala took for granted as the minimum required to exist in their world. So why did this invitation feel like a test she hadn't studied for? She picked it up on the 11th night when the apartment was quiet and the city outside her window was doing its usual late thing, sirens somewhere distant, someone's music bleeding through the walls, the particular hum of a city that never fully sleeps. She read the invitation once more. Then she called her friend Diane. "You're going," Diane said before Naomi finished explaining her hesitation. "I don't have anything to wear to something like this. You have the green dress. That's not a gala dress." Naomi." Diane's voice was flat and patient, the way it always got when she was about to say something Naomi didn't want to hear. "You built something from nothing. You go in there representing every girl in your program. You wear the green dress. You walk in with your back straight, and you remember who you are. And if they look at me like I don't belong there?" A pause. Then, "They will. You go anyway." Naomi stared at the invitation until the words blurred. Then she said, "Fine." The Riverside Plaza Hotel was everything she'd expected, and somehow worse for the expecting. Valets in white gloves, a red carpet that probably cost more per square foot than her monthly rent, women draped in gowns that looked like they'd been designed for the specific purpose of making other women feel invisible. Men in tuxedos that fit the way tuxedos only fit when they've been made specifically for your body by someone who charged accordingly. Naomi arrived in a rideshare, She wore the emerald green dress, knee-length, clean lines, nothing spectacular, bought 2 years ago for a fundraiser and worn 3 times since. She'd done her own hair, small gold earrings that had belonged to her mother, no designer bag, a small black clutch she'd found at a thrift store that looked more expensive than it was if you weren't looking closely. She handed her invitation to the man at the door and watched his eyes travel the length of her before he stepped aside without a word. She walked in. The ballroom was breathtaking in the way that things built purely for display are breathtaking. Not warm, not welcoming, but enormous and glittering and designed to make you feel the precise weight of how little you had compared to everyone else in the room. Crystal chandeliers, an orchestra playing something European and restrained, waiters moving through the crowd with trays of champagne and tiny food that cost more per bite than Naomi spent on groceries in a week. She took a glass of water, not champagne. She was working tonight, meeting with potential donors, representatives from foundations she'd been trying to get on the phone for months. This was not pleasure. This was strategy. She was good at strategy. For the first 40 minutes, it went reasonably well. She spoke with a program director from the Harris Family Foundation who expressed genuine interest in Rise's mentorship model. She exchanged cards with a woman named Patricia Okafor, who managed corporate giving for a regional bank and seemed to actually understand what Naomi was doing and why it mattered. Small victories. The kind that didn't feel small when you'd been fighting for them. Then Genevieve Holloway found her. Or rather, and this was the more accurate description, Genevieve Holloway's gaze found her, the way a searchlight finds the thing it's been scanning for, and locked on with the particular intensity of a woman who had decided that Naomi's presence in this room was a problem requiring immediate resolution. Genevieve was 51, blonde in the manner of women who have never stopped being blonde regardless of what nature intended, and wearing a gown that Naomi would later learn cost $14,000. She moved through the ballroom, the way people move when they have spent decades understanding that every room they enter belongs to them. Beside her were 2 women Naomi would come to know as Sandra Price and Margot Delacroix. One the wife of a tech executive, the other the daughter of a real estate family with properties in 6 states. They were laughing about something when they approached, and the laughter didn't stop when they reached Naomi. It just changed quality. "Oh," Genevieve said, and the single syllable carried everything it needed to carry. Her eyes moved over Naomi slowly. Weight first, dress second, skin third, in that order, each assessment arriving like a small, closed door. "Are you with the catering staff? Because I think they need help on the east side." Naomi's chest tightened. She had felt this before. She knew what it was, and she knew what it did to her body when it arrived. The heat that started at the back of her neck, the way her jaw wanted to lock, the particular exhaustion of having to decide in the space of 3 seconds whether to respond with fire or ice or neither. "I'm Naomi Brooks," she said, "Executive Director of Rise. I received an invitation to the gala." Genevieve's smile didn't change. "Rise." She repeated it like she was tasting something uncertain. "And what exactly does that do?" "Youth mentorship. We serve girls in underserved communities across Chicago, 3,000 young women in 4 years." "How admirable." Sandra Price said it with the kind of inflection that made admirable sound like the opposite. "And the foundation funded your ticket tonight? That must be nice, having other people pay your way in." Naomi said nothing. That was the thing she'd learned. Not in school, not from books, but from years of navigating rooms that didn't want her. Silence at the right moment was not defeat. It was preservation. It was choosing which battles consumed her energy and which ones she simply witnessed and filed away for later. But her silence read to them as weakness. And weakness, to women like these, was an invitation. "I'm sorry," Margot said, leaning slightly toward Genevieve like they were sharing a private joke. "But that dress, is that from Target? Because I genuinely cannot tell if this is a costume or a—" "Margot." Genevieve raised a hand, not to stop her, but to signal patience because she had something worse in mind and didn't want it interrupted. She looked at Naomi with an expression that was almost gentle, which made it more lethal. "Sweetheart, I don't know how you got in tonight. I'm sure someone meant well, but this is a room for people who have actually built something, not—" a gesture at Naomi, comprehensive and dismissive. A charity case, who runs a charity. The laughter arrived then, not just from Sandra and Margot, but from the 3 or 4 other people who had drifted close enough to overhear, drawn by the particular social magnetism of a public confrontation. Naomi looked at Genevieve. Steady. Breathing even. "I think I'll move on," Naomi said quietly. "Enjoy your evening." She turned. That was when she felt it. Cold, immediate, and spreading. The wine hit the back of her neck first, then cascaded down her hair, her shoulder, her spine, soaking through the emerald green fabric in a dark crimson flood that felt, for one disorienting second, like something had broken open inside her. She went still. Not from shock. She'd been shocked before, and shock made you move, made you gasp, made you react. This was different. This was the full-body understanding that something had just happened that could not be undone. That the world had shifted in a room full of witnesses, and that every single one of those witnesses was watching to see what she would do. She turned around slowly. Genevieve was holding an empty crystal wine glass, still smiling. Sandra was already raising her own glass. And then the second wave came, wine splashing across Naomi's left shoulder and the side of her face. Margot laughed so hard she had to grab Sandra's arm for support. The wine ran down Naomi's cheek. It dripped from the ends of her hair. The green dress was ruined. She could feel it soaking through to her skin, cold and humiliating and permanent. 500 people were in this ballroom. Not one of them moved. Some looked away. Some found something fascinating on the far wall. Some watched with the quiet, careful attention of people who wanted to see what happened without being associated with what happened. She heard a sound, the soft chime of phones being raised, screens lighting up. Recording. Security was already moving toward her, not toward Genevieve, toward Naomi. A large man in a dark suit materialized at her elbow. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me." "She didn't do anything," someone said from somewhere in the crowd. Naomi couldn't find the voice. Nobody repeated it. "She's been disturbing guests," Genevieve announced to no one in particular, and everyone simultaneously, her voice carrying the serene authority of a woman who had never once in her adult life been disbelieved. "I don't know how she got in, but this is clearly a misunderstanding." The security guard's hand closed around Naomi's upper arm. Not rough, but firm, guiding her toward the service exit with the efficiency of a man who had been paid to solve problems quietly. Naomi did not fight him. She said, "I'm sorry for the disturbance," and the words came out before she could stop them. The reflex of a lifetime spent apologizing for taking up space in rooms that resented her presence. The muscle memory of de-escalation, of surviving situations where fighting back meant a worse outcome. She hated herself for saying it the moment it left her mouth. She hated the way Genevieve's smile widened when she heard it. The walk across the ballroom floor felt approximately 4 miles long. Wine was still dripping from her hair. She kept her back straight. She had promised Diane she would keep her back straight. She was almost at the door. She didn't see the balcony above the main floor. She didn't see the single figure standing there, still and silent, who had watched everything from the moment the first glass was raised. She didn't see the way that figure's jaw had tightened, barely perceptibly, the way a wire tightens before it snaps, or the way he'd turned from the balcony railing with the kind of controlled deliberateness that, to anyone who knew him, was not calmness at all. It was what came before. The security guard pushed open a side door. Cold air hit Naomi's wine-soaked skin. The service corridor was all fluorescent light and industrial carpet and the smell of cleaning supplies, and she stood there for a moment just breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth, with her clutch still somehow in her hand and wine running slowly down the back of her knee, and she thought, very clearly, "I will not cry in this hallway." She thought, "I have stood in worse places than this." She thought, 3,000 girls. That's why you went in there. That's why you walked across that floor with your back straight. That's why you didn't scream at that woman the way every nerve in your body wanted to. She was reaching for her phone to call a rideshare home when she heard the ballroom behind her go completely, impossibly quiet. Not the natural pause between songs, not the polite hush before a speech. This was a different kind of silence. The kind that happens when something has entered a room that changes the atmosphere of the room, when the crowd suddenly understands that the rules of the evening have shifted and nobody knows yet what the new rules are. Then the main ballroom doors opened, and she heard Genevieve Holloway say, very quietly, her voice losing for the first time that smooth, rehearsed confidence, "Oh." Naomi stood in the fluorescent corridor, soaked in wine, and didn't yet know that the night was not over. She didn't yet know that the man walking through those doors had been watching her for months. She didn't know what he was about to do, but she was about to find out. Naomi heard it before she understood it. The silence that rolled through the ballroom was not the kind that happens gradually. The way a room quiets when a speaker approaches a microphone, the slow settling of a crowd finding its attention. This silence was instantaneous. One moment, the ballroom behind the service door was alive with the low orchestral hum of 500 wealthy people performing their wealth at each other, and the next moment, it simply stopped. The way a power line stops when it's been cut. She stood in the fluorescent corridor with wine cooling against her skin and her phone half raised, and she did not move. Some instinct she couldn't name told her not to move. She heard heels on marble, a lot of them, shifting, repositioning, the sound of a crowd physically rearranging itself to create space for something, or someone. Then she heard Genevieve Holloway say, "Oh," and the single syllable contained something Naomi had not heard in Genevieve's voice during the entire preceding exchange. Something that lived in the register below confidence and above panic. Fear. Naomi lowered her phone. The service door was heavy, industrial, fitted with a hydraulic arm that controlled its closing speed. She didn't push it open. She pressed her palm flat against it and let the pressure shift just enough, a half inch, maybe less, so that the sound from the ballroom reached her without announcing her presence. What she heard was footsteps. Not multiple footsteps. One set, deliberate and unhurried, crossing what she estimated was the full width of the ballroom floor based on how long they continued before stopping. Leather soles on marble. No scrape. No hesitation. The footsteps of a man who had never in his life needed to announce himself or apologize for taking his time. Then she heard a voice she didn't recognize. It was low, not loud. She had to press closer to the gap to catch it. But it carried in the way that voices carry when a room is holding its breath to receive them. The accent was American with something underneath it, something that suggested English had been learned on top of another language entirely, each word placed with a precision that most native speakers never bothered with. Where is she? Not a question. The inflection didn't rise. It landed like a statement of fact about something that had already been decided. Nobody answered immediately. Naomi could feel the hesitation through the door. Then a man's voice, she thought it was one of the security supervisors, said carefully, "Sir, she was asked to—" "I didn't ask you what she was asked to do." Another silence. "Where is she?" Naomi pushed the door open. The scene that met her was so precisely contrary to the one she had left that for a disorienting half-second, she thought she had walked into a different room. The crowd was pulled back from the center of the ballroom in a rough semicircle, the kind of negative space that bodies create when they are trying to be simultaneously present and elsewhere. The orchestra was not playing. The waitstaff had gone still. Every phone that had been raised to record her humiliation was now lowered, because the instinct to document had been replaced by a more pressing instinct, the instinct not to be noticed. At the center of the space stood a man. He was not the largest man in the room. He was not visibly armed. He wore a black suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who have stopped caring about communicating expense because they no longer need to communicate anything. It simply was what it was, and it was extraordinary. He was somewhere in his late 30s, dark-haired, pale, in the way of people from places with long winters, with a face that was composed but not friendly, watchful in a way that felt almost geological, like a cliff face that has absorbed a long time's worth of weather and is not particularly impressed by any of it. He was looking directly at Naomi. She had taken 3 steps into the ballroom before she fully registered this. She stopped. He crossed the remaining distance between them without waiting for permission, without acknowledging the 500 people arranged around him like a living frame. His eyes stayed on her face the entire time, not on the wine-soaked dress, not on the ruin of her hair. Her face. He stopped 3 feet in front of her. He reached back without looking, and one of the 2 silent men positioned 6 feet behind him stepped forward and placed something in his extended hand. He shook it out. His suit jacket, the jacket from the suit he was wearing, which meant he'd already removed it in the seconds between crossing the ballroom and reaching her. And he stepped forward and placed it over her shoulders with a careful, deliberate gentleness that was somehow more authoritative than anything Genevieve Holloway had done all evening. The jacket was warm. It smelled like cedar and something colder underneath, something that made her think inexplicably of winter in a place she'd never been. He was close enough now that she could see his eyes. Gray. The kind of gray that wasn't soft. From his jacket's breast pocket, he withdrew a folded white handkerchief and he lifted it toward her face, paused just before contact, a half second of asking without asking. And when she didn't pull back, he carefully pressed it against her cheek, where a rivulet of red wine had dried to a thin dark line just below her cheekbone. He said, very quietly, "Did anyone hurt you?" Still not a question. But the meaning was different this time. This one had weight behind it. This one was the kind of sentence that meant something was going to happen based on the answer, and he needed the information to calibrate how much. Naomi looked at him. She felt a complicated collection of things happening simultaneously inside her chest. Fury at the situation, residual humiliation that she was already trying to convert into something more useful, the physical discomfort of cold wine drying against her skin, and now this. A man she had never met placing his jacket on her shoulders in front of 500 witnesses with the calm certainty of someone who had decided something before he entered the room and was simply executing that decision now. "No," she said. It was only partially true, but the true part, the part about physical harm, was accurate, and the rest of it she was not prepared to lay at the feet of a stranger in a ballroom while 500 people watched. He nodded once, fractional. Then he turned. And the room, which had somehow managed to sustain its silence through the preceding 60 seconds, seemed to understand that the interval of quiet was over and that what came next would be something else entirely. Roman Volkov turned and looked at Genevieve Holloway. Genevieve was standing approximately 20 feet away. At some point during the preceding 2 minutes, she had gathered Sandra Price and Margot Delacroix around her like armor, the 3 of them arranged in a cluster that had the general shape of confidence and the actual structural integrity of wet paper. Her chin was up. Her grip on her champagne glass was white-knuckled. "Roman," she said. She tried for warm. She got brittle. "This is a surprise. We didn't expect you until... Who touched her?" The 3 words fell into the room like stones into standing water, and the ripples they produced were visible. Actual physical movement through the crowd as people shifted, people leaned toward each other, people looked to see who Roman Volkov was looking at, and then looked away from her quickly. Genevieve's smile flickered. "I'm sorry." "You heard me, Genevieve." The use of her first name in that tone produced a reaction she probably hadn't experienced in 25 years of being the most powerful woman in whichever room she occupied. Her shoulders dropped a quarter of an inch. Naomi, watching from inside the warm cage of Roman's jacket, cataloged this with grim satisfaction. "There was an incident," Genevieve said carefully. "A misunderstanding. This woman, her name is Naomi Brooks." A pause. "This Ms. Brooks was causing a disruption, and we simply, you poured wine on her." Flat, final. Genevieve's jaw tightened. The champagne glass rotated a slow half-turn in her fingers. "I think you may have been misinformed. It was an accident." What happened next was not something any of the 500 guests would easily describe afterward, because the mechanics of it were almost too simple, too unglamorous, to account for its impact. Roman Volkov raised his right hand, barely, a gesture that barely exceeded wrist height, and nodded once toward the far wall of the ballroom. The enormous LED display screens, 4 of them, installed for the Foundation's donor presentation slideshow and still warm from the earlier graphics, lit up simultaneously. The footage was security camera footage, multiple angles, ballroom quality image resolution, timestamp burning in the lower right corner in white numerals, the kind of system installed in hotels that cost several $100s per night per room and could afford infrastructure accordingly. Every screen showed Genevieve Holloway lifting a full crystal glass of red wine and tipping it, not fumbling, not stumbling. The movement was smooth and purposeful, and there was a precise moment where she looked directly at the back of Naomi's neck before she did it, over Naomi's head. There was no misunderstanding available in that footage. There was no angle or lighting condition or momentary blur that reframed what was visible. There was a woman choosing to do something to another woman, and then doing it, and then smiling while she watched the result. The second screen showed Sandra Price raising her own glass 3 seconds later. The third screen showed Margot Delacroix laughing. The footage ran for approximately 45 seconds and then stopped. The ballroom was so quiet that Naomi could hear the hydraulic whisper of the service door behind her swinging fully closed. Genevieve's champagne glass hit the floor. Not thrown, dropped. Her hand had simply stopped holding it. The glass didn't shatter. It bounced once on the marble and rolled in a small, absurd arc that nobody moved to stop. "That's not," Sandra Price started. "Don't." Roman said it without looking at her. His eyes hadn't left Genevieve. Genevieve was doing something complicated with her face. Naomi had seen the particular calculation before, not in rooms this expensive, but in school hallways and city council meetings, in grant application reviews where the person across the table suddenly realized the dynamic was not what they'd assumed. The calculation was, how bad is this exactly, and is there a version of the next 30 seconds where I come out with something intact? Genevieve landed on performance. She was, in her way, a professional. "Roman," she straightened. "I understand this looks... I want to tell you something about this organization," Roman said, and he said it without volume, without drama, the way a person recites something factual, the boiling point of water, the speed of sound. The Holloway Foundation received a founding gift of $2.3 million from a private trust in 2019. That trust is mine. In the 4 years since, the foundation's operational budget has been supplemented by investment returns from a real estate development fund. That fund is managed by an LLC. I own controlling interest in the LLC. He let that land. When I withdraw that support, he continued, the foundation's next fiscal quarter becomes unresolvable. Not difficult, unresolvable. That is not a threat, Genevieve. I'm describing a sequence of events that will follow naturally from a decision I've already made. The crowd wasn't breathing anymore. Naomi wasn't entirely sure she was breathing anymore. Genevieve's composure cracked. Not visibly, not dramatically, but Naomi was close enough to see the place beneath the eye where the muscle twitched. "You can't. I also want to tell you about Marcus Price," Roman said, sliding smoothly past her objection the way water slides past a rock it has already decided to go around. His eyes moved to Sandra. "Marcus Price's firm has a commercial leasing arrangement with a property management company in the River North District. That company is a subsidiary of a parent organization I've advised my associates to terminate all cooperation with, effective this week." Sandra Price made a sound. It was small and involuntary, and it came from somewhere below her sternum. "And Thomas Delacroix." Roman looked at Margot now, and Margot Delacroix, who was 43 years old and had spent those 43 years learning that her family name was a kind of permanent social insulation, took a physical step backward. Thomas Delacroix's development portfolio in the South Loop includes 3 sites with pending zoning variance applications. Those applications require sign-off from a city planning board. I have relationships with 2 members of that board. Those relationships are no longer available to Thomas. The silence in the room had taken on a physical quality. It pressed against the eardrums. It made the space feel smaller than its dimensions. Genevieve's voice, when it came, had lost something essential from it. A structural element, a load-bearing piece of the architecture of her self-presentation. "Roman, please. Whatever we've done here, it wasn't meant... You meant every word of it." Something in his voice when he said those 4 words made Naomi's chest constrict. Not because it was loud, because it was true. And he said it the way truth sounds when someone is simply tired of watching people pretend otherwise. She walked into this room with an invitation, he said. She walked across this floor without bothering anyone. She told you her name and what she'd built, and you decided that none of that was sufficient to earn her the right to stand in the same room as you. His eyes moved back to Genevieve. You poured wine on her because you could, because you believed no one in this room would stop you, because you have spent so long in rooms where no one stops you that you stopped being able to imagine it was possible. He paused. You were wrong about that. Genevieve's mouth opened. Nothing came out. You were wrong about a great many things tonight, Roman said, but that particular mistake has the most significant consequences. Naomi became aware, slowly, in the way you become aware of things when shock is still metabolizing, that the room around her had undergone a transformation that had nothing to do with the physical space. The same 500 people who had watched her walk across a ballroom floor soaked in wine without intervening were now watching Roman Volkov with the rapt, terrified attention of people who understood that the hierarchy they'd arrived here operating under had been replaced, cleanly and without ceremony, by a different one. She didn't know what to do with that. She didn't know what to do with any of this. She knew she should be grateful. She knew, on one level, that something was happening here that was definitively on her side. But there was another level, lower, older, more stubborn, that was watching a man she had never met dismantle the lives of other human beings with the efficient calm of someone culling a garden. And that level of her was not entirely comfortable with what it saw, even when what it saw was aimed at people who had done something genuinely terrible. Power was power. The direction it moved didn't change what it was. She was still working through this when Roman turned back toward her. I'm going to ask you something, he said quietly, low enough that only she could hear. And I want you to tell me the truth. She looked at him. Okay. Do you want to leave? She blinked. Of all the questions she had been bracing for, that was not one of them. I can have a car outside in 90 seconds, he said. Nobody stops you. Nobody follows you. Tonight is done. Or, the gray eyes held hers. You can stay. And I'll ask you one more question in front of this room. He paused. The choice is yours. I need you to make it. Naomi looked at the service door behind her. She looked at the ballroom in front of her. She looked at Genevieve Holloway, who was standing in the rubble of the last 45 minutes with her practiced composure trying and mostly failing to rebuild itself. And she thought about the walk across the ballroom floor with wine running down her spine and the security guard's hand on her arm, and her own voice saying, I'm sorry for the disturbance, and the way Genevieve's smile had widened when she heard it. She thought about Diane saying, you go anyway. She thought about 3,000 girls. She took one step forward and she said, I'll stay. Roman nodded. He turned back to the room. And in that moment, before he spoke, before anything else happened, in the still half-second between what had already occurred and what was about to, Naomi noticed something she hadn't registered before. The two silent men behind him, who had moved with him from the door without speaking or being spoken to, were not looking at Roman. They were looking outward, their attention sweeping the room in a continuous, practiced motion that had a quality to it she recognized instinctively from news footage and history books, and the particular way certain situations were described by people who had been close to them. These men were not assistants. These men were not bodyguards in the ordinary sense. These men were positioned the way people position themselves when they are protecting something they have been told not to lose. Naomi felt the jacket on her shoulders and looked at the back of Roman Volkov's head and thought, who are you exactly? And what is it going to mean that you were standing on that balcony watching me? But she didn't have time to work through the answer, because Roman raised his voice, not to a shout, barely above his normal register, but with a carrying quality that reached the orchestra's empty chairs and the bar at the far end and the top tier of the gallery above, and said, before the evening continues, there's one more thing this room should understand. Genevieve looked up. The organization that bears your family name, Roman said, has operated for 6 years on the understanding that its largest anonymous donor would continue support indefinitely. That donor, as of this moment, in this room, in front of these witnesses, is withdrawing. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, the jacket currently around Naomi's shoulders, and produced a single folded document which he extended toward a man near the front of the crowd, who Naomi would later learn was the foundation's executive director. The terms of withdrawal are documented here. You'll find the timeline is immediate. The executive director's face went the color of old ash. Furthermore, Roman turned slightly, addressing not Genevieve specifically now, but the room at large, the way you address a classroom when the lesson is for everyone. Every business arrangement, partnership agreement, or contractual relationship between my organizations and any individual or company represented by the three women standing behind me will be reviewed for termination, effective Monday morning. My legal team has been notified. The process is already underway. He said it without drama. The absence of drama was the most devastating thing about it. Genevieve Holloway's knees bent. Not a collapse, a controlled descent, but controlled by the barest margin, her body making the decision for her before her mind had finished objecting to it. She went down onto one knee on the marble floor of the ballroom she had organized, the ballroom she had presided over for 6 consecutive years, with 500 members of the Chicago social elite watching her. And she said, "Roman, please." "Don't," he said. Her head dropped. Sandra Price was crying. Not elegantly. The mascara had already begun its migration. Margot Delacroix had her hand over her mouth and was looking at her husband across the room with an expression that communicated a specific and immediate fear about what he was going to say to her when they got home, about what this meant for the Delacroix name, about the very specific texture of the life they had built, and the possibility that Roman Volkov had just described the first crack in its foundation. Margot's husband wasn't looking back at her. He was looking at Roman. Several other men in the room were looking at Roman with the same expression, an expression that was not quite fear and not quite respect, but something that combined elements of both, and also contained a third thing that was harder to name, something that had to do with the sudden recalibration of understanding about where you stood in a hierarchy you thought you had figured out. Naomi watched all of this from inside the warm weight of a stranger's jacket. She watched Genevieve on one knee on the marble floor. She watched the executive director holding a document with hands that weren't entirely steady. She watched 500 people trying to decide where to look. And she felt something she hadn't expected to feel in this moment, something that sat alongside the grim satisfaction, complicated and unwelcome. Because Genevieve on her knees was satisfying in a deep animal way that she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. That was real. But it was also, and this was the part she hadn't expected, a little bit frightening. Not Genevieve specifically, the speed of it, the completeness, the way a man had walked into a room and spoken 4 sentences, and a woman's entire world had shifted on its axis before she had time to understand what was happening. The same thing that had been done to her in the service corridor, the sudden total reversal of what you thought the room was, had just been done to Genevieve. The mechanism was different. The speed was identical. Naomi looked at Roman's back. She didn't know what she was going to say to him when he turned around again. She knew she had questions that were going to need answers. She knew that whatever had brought him to that balcony tonight, whatever had kept him watching, whatever had led to him removing his jacket and crossing a ballroom floor with the certainty of a man who had already made a decision, none of that had been explained, and explanations mattered. They mattered to her specifically. She had spent her life navigating the difference between people who helped you because they wanted something and people who helped you because it was right, and she had developed, over the course of 28 years, a fairly accurate instinct for which was which. That instinct was currently, in Roman Volkov's case, giving her 2 contradictory answers simultaneously. She didn't like that. She was still sitting with that discomfort when she became aware of a sound from the far corner of the ballroom, near the bar, near the cluster of photographers who had been covering the gala and who had been, until the last 10 minutes, primarily interested in the society shots and the foundation leadership and the various attractive angles available in a room full of expensive people. They were not taking society shots now. Every camera in the room was pointed at Roman. One of the photographers, young, ponytailed, the kind of hungry-eyed that comes from shooting events for 3 years and waiting for the one that becomes something, had her phone raised not toward Roman, but toward the LED screens, which still displayed the final frozen frame of Genevieve's expression in the moment before the wine glass tipped. Naomi watched the photographer and thought, this is already outside this room. Whatever happened in the next 10 minutes, whatever happened in the next hour, the footage on those screens had already been seen by 500 people who each had a phone and a social media presence and a circle of contacts who would receive this image before midnight. This was already a story. She just didn't know yet whose story it was going to be, or what role she was going to be assigned in it, or whether Roman Volkov, who had walked through those doors and placed his jacket on her shoulders and spoken her name to a woman who'd tried to erase it, was someone she could trust with the answer to any of those questions. She was about to find out, because he turned around, and the look on his face when he met her eyes across those 3 feet of marble was not the look of a man who had finished what he came to do. It was the look of a man who had barely started. He said, "I owe you an explanation." And Naomi said, "Yeah, you do." And that was when the ballroom doors, the main entrance, the double doors that had parted for Roman 15 minutes ago, burst open again, this time without ceremony, without silence, with instead the particular explosive energy of people who did not care about ceremony or silence, people in dark clothing who moved with coordinated efficiency into the room and fanned out along its perimeter, and from somewhere behind them came the unmistakable digital chirp of police radio, and one of Roman's silent men said something very quietly into a device near his collar, and Roman's expression changed, not to fear, nothing that simple, to the expression of a man who had understood that tonight had become something significantly more complicated than he had planned for, and that the explanation he had just promised Naomi Brooks was going to have to wait. The men who came through the doors were not police. Naomi understood this in the first 3 seconds, before her brain had finished processing the visual information, because the instinct that had kept her alive and functional in neighborhoods where threat assessment was a survival skill and not an academic exercise told her something was wrong about the formation, wrong about the clothing, wrong about the particular quality of attention these men were paying to the room versus the quality of attention actual law enforcement paid when they entered a space. Police looked at the crowd. These men looked at Roman. There were 6 of them. Dark clothing, yes, but not uniforms. The kind of clothing that was dark the way working clothing is dark, functional, and unremarkable, designed not to communicate anything. They spread along the perimeter of the ballroom with a precision that was almost choreographic, each man reaching a position and stopping there, and the spread of their positions created a loose perimeter around the room that had a specific geometry to it, the geometry of containment. They were not here to arrest anyone. They were here to make sure no one left. Roman had gone very still, not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of a man recalibrating rapidly, running calculations behind his eyes at a speed that didn't show on his face because his face had stopped being an accurate indicator of his internal state sometime in the preceding decade or more. His 2 men had moved, not dramatically, not with any visible urgency, but they had repositioned themselves so that one was slightly ahead of Roman and one was slightly to his left, and the geometry of that repositioning put Naomi behind all 3 of them without anyone having told her to move there or asked her permission. She had been repositioned without being touched. She noticed this. One of the newcomers walked forward from the perimeter. He was older than the others, mid-50s, heavy-set in the way of men who were once substantial and have remained so through different means, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had long ago finished becoming what it was going to be and was no longer interested in the process. He wore a dark wool coat. His hands were in his pockets. He walked like a man who was in no hurry because he understood that the room's time was already his. He stopped 10 feet from Roman. "Roman Mikhailovich," he said. The name landed differently than Naomi expected. Not because of what it was, she understood it was Roman's full name, or a version of it, but because of what the man's voice did when it said it. There was familiarity in it, not warmth. Familiarity the way a surgeon is familiar with a specific procedure. He had said this name before, many times, in many rooms. The name was not new information to him. It was a tool he was picking up. Roman said, "Victor." 1 word. The name came out clean, no inflection, but something in Naomi's chest registered the effort that neutrality cost him because she had been watching his face for the last 20 minutes, and she knew what the default register of his expression looked like when it wasn't costing him anything, and this was different. Victor smiled. It was a professional smile. The smile of a man who had used smiles as instruments long enough that they no longer needed to correspond to any actual internal state. "You've had an eventful evening," Victor said. His English was good, accented more heavily than Roman's, the vowels shaped by a different architecture. "This isn't the place," Roman said. "No." Victor looked around the ballroom with the mild, assessing gaze of a property inspector. "It isn't. But you chose the place, not me." His eyes moved, briefly, deliberately, to Naomi, then back to Roman. "You've been difficult to find for several weeks. I wasn't hiding. You weren't answering, which in our business amounts to the same thing." Victor took one hand out of his pocket. Empty. He held it up briefly in a gesture of display, then returned it. "The organization has questions, Roman, about the Chicago accounts, about the restructuring you implemented in February without consultation, about several transfers that occurred through the Cayman instrument in March." He paused. "About decisions you have been making unilaterally that affect arrangements that belong to more people than just you." The 500 guests in the ballroom had achieved a quality of stillness that Naomi had never experienced in a crowd before. No coughing, no shifting, no whispered consultation. They were a held breath, collectively, every one of them understanding with the animal certainty of creatures who have encountered a situation above their pay grade that the correct behavior right now was invisibility. Genevieve Holloway was still on one knee on the floor. She hadn't moved. Naomi wasn't sure she was capable of moving. Roman said, "We can discuss this at a more appropriate, we'll discuss it now." Victor's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Or my associates will be making several calls tonight that will have consequences for your Chicago operations that will make your conversation with Mrs. Holloway look like a minor inconvenience." Something happened in the room after he said that. Naomi felt it more than saw it. A shift in the atmospheric pressure of the space, the way the air changes before weather. The two men behind Roman had gone from alert to something beyond alert, something that had a different name, and one of Victor's 6 men on the perimeter had moved his right hand to a position near his coat's left lapel and left it there. Naomi understood, with total and sudden clarity, that she was standing in the middle of something that had been happening long before tonight, something that tonight's events had accelerated into visibility but had not created, and that her presence here, the wine, the jacket, the LED screens, all of it, was a thread in a fabric she had not known existed until this moment. Roman turned to her. His face, this close in this light, was controlled in a way that she now recognized as the outer surface of something more complex underneath. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. She counted them. "I need you to go with Demetria," he said. He indicated the man to his left. "He'll take you somewhere safe. I'll explain everything." "No." The word came out before she'd finished deciding to say it. Roman blinked. It was the first involuntary thing she'd seen his face do. "Naomi, you said you owe me an explanation." She kept her voice low. "That was 60 seconds ago. You don't get to renegotiate that because the situation got complicated." She looked at Victor and his men in the 6 positions around the perimeter and looked back at Roman. "What is this?" "This isn't the right... What is this, Roman?" The use of his first name did something to his expression, complicated it. He looked at her for another moment with an assessment in his eyes that was different from the assessment he'd been making across the ballroom for the last 20 minutes. This one was trying to determine something specific about her, something he needed to know before he decided what to say next. Whatever he found, it made him close his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them and said, "My name is Roman Volkov. I run the largest organized crime network operating in the central United States. I have been running it for 11 years. The charitable work I've funded, including foundations connected to the organizations you've interacted with, is real. The money behind it is not clean." The sentence arrived, and Naomi absorbed it the way you absorb a physical impact, the body receiving the information before the mind has decided what to do with it. "The man across from me," Roman continued, "represents the European branch of the organization I nominally report to. I say nominally because for the past 18 months, I have been systematically reducing that reporting relationship in preparation for a separation that his employers do not yet officially know about. He paused. Tonight has accelerated that timeline, Victor said from his 10 feet away in a conversational tone. She doesn't need to know this, Roman. She's standing in the middle of it, Roman said without looking at him. She deserves to know what she's standing in the middle of. She's a civilian. She was a civilian when you walked through that door. That designation has become more complicated. He looked at Naomi. I'm sorry. For what it's worth. And I understand if it's worth very little right now. None of what happened tonight was something I planned or wanted for you. Naomi stared at him. The jacket was still on her shoulders. She was suddenly very aware of it. She said, How long have you known who I am? 8 months. How? The Harris Family Foundation. You presented Rise's annual impact report at their donor summit in October. I was in the building for a separate meeting. I saw the presentation from a hallway monitor. Something moved in his face. You were explaining your dropout intervention program to a room of people who were mostly looking at their phones, and you didn't change your delivery once. Not once in 40 minutes. You spoke to them the same way you would have spoken to a room that was paying full attention. Naomi's jaw was tight. And that made you decide to, what, watch me for 8 months? It made me want to know who you were. The watching was a consequence of learning. That's surveillance, Roman. Yes, he said simply. It was. And I understand that's a problem. Victor said, This is touching. Roman, the accounts. Victor. Roman turned to look at him for the first time since the conversation with Naomi had begun. And the quality of his attention when it turned toward Victor was distinctly different from the quality he'd been giving Naomi. Colder, more precise, carrying the particular focused weight of two men who understood each other completely and found that understanding mutually threatening. I told you we can discuss the accounts. We cannot discuss them here, in this room, in front of these people. You don't make that determination anymore. I make it tonight. Victor studied him. You're not in a position to, what? I am in every position. Roman's voice didn't rise, but something in its frequency changed, dropped into a register that made the air in the immediate vicinity feel different. You came into this room with 6 men, Victor. I came in with 2. You know what that means about how I've structured the last 18 months? And you know it means that 6 men is not a number that concerns me. So let's be precise about what's actually happening here. He took one step toward Victor. Just one. You came because the account scared you. The account scared you because you finally understood that the restructuring wasn't financial housekeeping. It was preparation. And you came tonight, in this room, in front of witnesses, because you wanted me off balance. He paused. How's that working? Victor's professional smile had thinned. It was still present, but it had become structural only, a form maintained by habit rather than intention. The board wants answers, Victor said. The board will get a meeting. The board wants more than a... The board, Roman said, will get what I decide to give it, when I decide to give it, because the board's leverage over my operations has been decreasing at a rate of approximately 12% per quarter for 6 quarters. And everyone in that room in Zurich knows it, even if nobody's said it plainly. He stopped. I'm saying it plainly. You can tell them I said it. Something shifted in Victor's face. The smile disappeared entirely. What replaced it was not anger. It was the expression of a man updating a risk assessment in real time and not enjoying the update. You've made a significant error, Victor said. In judgment? In timing? Possibly. Roman's voice was even. I've made errors before. They tend to be survivable. Not this category of error. We'll see. Victor looked at him for a long moment. Then his eyes went again to Naomi. This time they stayed longer. This time the assessment in them was more specific, more clinical, and it produced in Naomi's chest a sensation that she identified precisely and immediately as the sensation of being evaluated as a variable in someone else's equation. The woman becomes a complication, Victor said. The woman, Roman said, is not part of this conversation. She is now. You've made her part of it. Victor's eyes stayed on Naomi. What's your name? She doesn't answer to you, Roman said. I was asking her. Naomi said, Naomi Brooks. She said it the same way she'd said it to Genevieve, flat, clear, unembellished. Whatever fear she was feeling, and she was feeling it, she had learned to keep it in a room inside herself with the door closed. I run a nonprofit. I came here tonight to meet donors. I didn't ask for any of this. Victor nodded slowly. And yet here you are. He looked at Roman. You've created an exposure. I've created nothing. You created the exposure by walking in here. We'll discuss that differently when we're not performing for an audience. Victor took his other hand out of his pocket. Still empty. He was very deliberate about showing his hands. The accounts, Roman. Monday. You know the location. Roman said nothing. Victor held his gaze for another 3 seconds, then turned and walked back toward the door. His 6 men peeled off the perimeter in sequence and followed. The process took approximately 45 seconds, and during those 45 seconds the ballroom was so quiet that Naomi could hear the faint sound of someone crying. She couldn't locate it exactly, thought it might be Sandra Price somewhere in the crowd, or possibly Margot, or possibly someone else entirely who had been pushed past the threshold of this evening's capacity to sustain composure. The doors closed. The room exhaled. Roman turned back to Naomi. She pulled his jacket off her shoulders. She held it out to him. She needed to not be wearing it right now. She needed there to be some distance between herself and the situation, some physical marker of boundary, and the jacket was the only instrument available. He took it. His eyes stayed on her face. Say what you need to say, he said. You funded organizations that put money near my work. Her voice was controlled. She was working at keeping it controlled, and she could feel the effort it cost. For 8 months, without telling me, without asking me. Yes. And the money behind those organizations is from criminal enterprise. Yes. Which means that every grant cycle Rise has benefited from that touched those foundations. Your organization has not received direct funding from any entity I control. His voice was careful. I've confirmed that specifically. The foundations you've interacted with received legitimate donations processed through clean instruments. Your nonprofit's funding is clean. You checked. I checked. Because you were watching me. Yes. She looked at him. The wine on her skin had dried completely now. The evening felt approximately 3 years long. Why did you come into this room tonight? The honest answer, not the one that sounds... She stopped herself. Just the honest one. Roman was quiet for a moment. Around them, the ballroom was beginning to recover its functions. Not its social functions, those were definitively over, but its physical ones. People moving, talking in low voices, the gradual restoration of motion to a space that had been frozen. I was going to speak to you tonight, he said, after the gala. I had arranged to be at this event because I knew you'd been invited. I wanted to... He stopped, started differently. I've been looking for a way to exist in your proximity that didn't involve the parts of my life that would make that proximity something you'd reject. He said it without decoration, without the smoothness that could have made it easier to receive. I hadn't found it yet. Tonight was supposed to be a beginning of looking for it. Something moved through his expression. Then I saw what they did to you. Naomi stood with that for a moment. The way you walked across that floor, he said, after, with the wine. The way you kept your back straight and apologized for something you hadn't done. I've watched people in worse situations lose every piece of dignity they came in with. You didn't lose any of it. His jaw was tight, and they were laughing. She looked away from him, toward the doors Victor had left through, toward the perimeter where 6 men had stood and then gone. Those men, she said. Victor, what happens Monday? Monday is my problem. It became my problem the moment he looked at me and called me an exposure. She looked back at Roman. I've spent 4 years building something. 3,000 kids, staff, donors, programs. I built all of it in a city that didn't want me to. And if it gets within visible distance of whatever you're in the middle of... She stopped because the sentence completed itself in the silence, and she didn't need to finish it. Roman heard the unfinished part. She could see it land. "I'll contain it," he said. "You told Victor he wasn't in a position to determine things. I'm telling you the same thing." Her voice was steady. "You don't get to contain it without telling me what I'm at risk from. You don't get to make those decisions for me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she wasn't expecting. "You're right." The two words in his mouth sounded like they had not been used frequently in recent years. "Monday's meeting," he said. "Victor represents a faction within the organization that has been trying to reassert control over my operations for 18 months. I've been systematically removing their leverage. The accounts he referenced are accounts I've restructured in ways that reduce their access to revenue streams they've considered guaranteed. They're not happy." "How unhappy?" "Enough to come to a public venue." "That's not an answer." "Unhappy enough that Monday's meeting carries risks. I'm not going to minimize for your comfort." He looked at her directly. "I've been in dangerous situations before. This one is different because it involves a timeline I accelerated tonight, and because Victor now knows that there is someone who could theoretically be used as a point of pressure." Naomi's chest went cold. Not dramatically, just cold. "He won't," Roman said. "I'll make that clear Monday." "How do you make something like that clear to someone like that?" "In the language that someone like that understands." She didn't ask him to translate that. She understood the translation. She stood in the middle of the ballroom, the same ballroom she had crossed 20 minutes ago soaked in wine, and she looked at the man in front of her and she worked through what she knew and what she didn't know, and what the distance was between those two things, and the distance was enormous. And she was 28 years old, and she ran a nonprofit for girls who needed someone to show them that the world was navigable if you were honest and persistent and refused to let cruelty define the boundaries of your ambition. She had walked into this building tonight to make that world slightly more navigable. She was not sure yet what she was walking out with. She said, "I need to think." "Okay. I need to not be in this building while I do it. I'll have a car. I'll get my own car." She picked up her small black clutch from where it had survived the entire evening on the marble floor beside her. The wine stain on the floor where she'd been standing was still visible, a dark red shadow on white stone. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Roman. "You said my funding is clean." "It's clean." "You're certain?" "I'm certain." She nodded once. She turned toward the main entrance. She had taken 4 steps when she heard someone call her name. Not Roman, not Victor's retreating shadow, but a voice from the crowd, a woman's voice, and she turned to find a young woman she didn't recognize, maybe 22, with a press credential hanging from a lanyard and a phone still recording. "Ms. Brooks, can you comment on what happened tonight? The footage of the incident is already online. There are 3 separate clips with over 100,000 views combined, and it's been 40 minutes. Naomi stopped walking. 100,000 views in 40 minutes. She looked at the journalist. She looked at the phone. She looked at the frozen frame, still visible on the nearest LED screen. Genevieve's face in the moment before the glass tipped. She thought about the girls in her program who had grown up being told in every possible language by every possible system that their bodies and their skin and their neighborhoods disqualified them from the rooms they deserved to be in. She thought about what 100,000 views in 40 minutes became by morning. She thought about Roman Volkov behind her, and Victor through those doors, and Monday, and the word exposure. She thought about Diane saying, "You go anyway." "Yes," Naomi said to the journalist, and the word came out steadier than she felt. "I'll comment." She turned fully to face the phone's camera, and she straightened her back, and she was aware with sudden piercing clarity that she was standing at an intersection she had not chosen and could not unchoose, between a story that was already in motion and a world that was already watching, between the version of this night where she walked home quietly and the version where she became something none of the people in this room had planned for. She had 2 seconds to decide which version she was living in. The footage was already online. The world was already watching. And behind her, Roman Volkov stood very still, and for the first time since he had walked through those doors, there was something in his expression that was not calculation, not control, not the managed certainty of a man who had structured his life to eliminate the condition of not knowing what came next. He was watching her the way you watch something that has stopped being predictable, and he was... She spoke for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. She knew the duration afterward because the journalist told her and because the footage, a single unbroken shot, phone camera, slightly shaky at the margins but steady enough where it counted, was later time-stamped and analyzed by 17 separate media outlets who would spend the following week arguing about what exactly Naomi Brooks had done in that ballroom and whether it constituted activism or provocation or something that didn't have a clean category yet. What she did was this. She stood in front of a phone camera in a wine-stained emerald dress inside a room full of Chicago's wealthiest people, and she told the truth. Not all of it. Not the parts about Victor or the accounts or the word exposure landing in her chest like a stone dropped into deep water. Those parts she folded away into the interior room where she kept the things she wasn't ready to deal with yet. The parts she told were the parts that mattered to the 3,000 girls whose names she carried into every room she entered. She said, "I came here tonight with an invitation, an address, and 11 years of work." She said, "I was told I didn't belong here before anyone asked what I'd built." She said, "The women who poured wine on me did it because they believed the room would let them." She said, "They were right about the room." She said, "Rooms like this have been right about rooms like this for a very long time." She said, "I'm not angry at the wine. I'm angry at the certainty. The absolute unquestioned certainty that I would absorb it and disappear and the evening would continue." She said, "It's not going to continue." She said it without raising her voice. She said it looking directly into the camera lens, not at the crowd, not at Roman behind her, not at Genevieve Holloway, who was still somewhere on the periphery of the room in the wreckage of the evening she had constructed. When she finished, she lowered her eyes from the camera, and the journalist said, "Thank you," in a voice that was slightly unsteady. And Naomi said, "You're welcome," and turned and walked toward the main entrance and pushed through the doors and stood on the front steps of the Riverside Plaza Hotel in the October night air with wine dried on her skin and a city spread out in front of her going about its usual business of being a city. She called a rideshare. 8 minutes. She sat on the front steps in Roman Volkov's. No, she had given it back. She sat on the front steps in her wine-soaked dress, and she put her hands between her knees, and she stared at the street, and she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and she did not think about Monday or Victor or exposure or the particular tone of Roman's voice when he said the money is clean. I've confirmed it specifically, as if confirming it had been a thing he understood he would need to do long before tonight made it necessary. She thought about the girls. She thought about Keisha Morrison, 14, who had come into the RISE program 8 months ago, unable to make eye contact, and who last month had stood in front of a room of 30 people and delivered a 5-minute presentation on urban agriculture with the particular fierce pride of someone discovering for the first time that her voice filled a room. She thought about whether the video was going to help or hurt the program. She thought about donor calls tomorrow. She thought about her board chair, Margaret Osei, who was going to see the footage and call her before 8 a.m. and who was going to have a lot of questions that deserved honest answers. She thought about Roman. She was still thinking about Roman when the black SUV pulled up. Not her rideshare. The car was dark and expensive, and it idled at the curb with the specific patience of a vehicle driven by someone who was being paid to wait, rather than someone who was billing by the minute. And the window came down, and Dmitri, the man from Roman's left side, said, "Mr. Volkov would like a word before you go." Naomi looked at the SUV. She looked at her phone. Her rideshare was 6 minutes away. "Tell him I know where he can reach me," she said. "He said you'd say that." Dimitri's face was professionally neutral. "He also said to tell you that Victor's people have been outside this building since before the gala started. 2 cars. North side of the block." Naomi looked north. Dark street. Parked cars. 2 of them with engines running, exhaust visible in the cold air. She got in the SUV. Roman was in the back seat. He had put his jacket back on. He looked, she thought, like a man who had spent the last 15 minutes doing something difficult inside his own head, and had arrived at the other side of it, not visibly damaged, but not unchanged either. "The cars will follow whatever vehicle you leave in tonight," he said, before she'd finished closing the door. "Not aggressively. Not to intercept. Victor is gathering information, who you are, where you live, what Rise's structure looks like, who's connected to you. He's building a file." The SUV moved, smooth, unhurried. "He moves fast," Naomi said. "He's been doing this for 30 years. Roman was looking at the window. "The public statement you made, I I know. It changes the calculus. I know. 100,000 views becomes 500,000 by morning. Your name is attached to footage of two of the most recognizable socialites in this city pouring wine on a nonprofit director. That story is going to run in every... I know, Roman. She looked at him. I made the calculation. I made it in 2 seconds in front of a camera, and I understood what I was choosing. I'm not asking you to manage it. He looked at her. I'm not trying to manage it. Then why are you listing the consequences? Because the same visibility that protects your organization from Victor, that makes Rise untouchable by association, too prominent to threaten quietly, also puts a spotlight on everyone connected to it. But his voice was even. Including the people who funded its proximity events. If a journalist starts pulling the thread on the foundations that share donor networks with Rise, the chain gets complicated quickly. Naomi felt it then. The full weight of the thing she'd been standing in the middle of for the last hour, felt it the way you feel the size of something when you finally step back far enough to see its edges. You're saying my visibility protects me but exposes you, she said. I'm saying the two things are connected in a way neither of us designed and both of us now have to manage. I didn't create that connection. No, he said. I did. He said it flatly, without defense. I made choices over the last 8 months that created an intersection. Tonight accelerated it. I'm not asking you to be comfortable with that. I'm telling you that it exists so you can make informed decisions about what comes next. Naomi looked out the window. The city moved past in the way the city moved past at night. Pools of light and stretches of dark. The particular grammar of a place that was always in the middle of several different stories at once. What comes next? She said. Monday. What actually happens Monday? Roman was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of evasion, the quiet of precise construction, finding words that were accurate rather than comfortable. Victor's faction represents approximately 40% of the organization's senior structure, he said. For 18 months, I've been building relationships with the remaining 60%, directly, quietly, through channels that Victor doesn't control. Monday's meeting is Victor's attempt to force a confrontation before that process is complete. Is it complete? 80%. That's not 100. No. So Monday is a problem. Monday is a problem, he confirmed. The accounts Victor referenced, I restructured them in February specifically to reduce the organization's leverage over my Chicago operations. The effect was to make my network here operationally independent. Victor's employers understand that if that independence becomes permanent and recognized, the revenue streams they've relied on from this territory disappear. So they sent Victor to stop that from happening. They sent Victor to remind me that they still have instruments I care about. He paused. You are now, as of 1 hour ago, one of those instruments. Not because Victor knows anything specific about my interest in you. He doesn't, or he didn't before tonight. But because I walked across a ballroom floor and put my jacket on your shoulders in front of 500 witnesses, which in the language Victor's employers use, is a declaration. Naomi's hands were flat on her thighs. She was looking at her own hands. A declaration of what? She said. That you matter to me. The sentence came out without architecture around it, just the sentence. In our world, that's information, and information is leverage. The SUV stopped at a red light. The city idled around them. I need to get out of this car, Naomi said. Not urgently, flatly. I know. I need to go home and take a shower and sit with everything you just told me and figure out what I actually think about it. I know. And then I need to call my board chair and my development director, and I need to think about whether the visibility from tonight helps or hurts the kids in my program. And I need to make those decisions without... She stopped. Without me, he said. Without your version of events being the one I'm operating from, she said precisely. Because your version of events has a vested interest. He looked at her. Something moved through his face that was not offense and not hurt. It was the expression of a man who had been told an accurate thing and was acknowledging its accuracy even though the accuracy was uncomfortable. That's fair, he said. I know it is. The light changed. Dmitri will take you home, Roman said. Different route. The cars outside the hotel will follow for a while and then lose interest when they confirm you're going somewhere residential and not operational. He looked at her. I'll contact you Tuesday, after Monday is resolved. And if it isn't resolved, he held her gaze. It'll be resolved. You're certain? I'm prepared. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. The city went on outside the glass, indifferent and continuous. Tuesday, she said. She rode the rest of the way in silence. She was home by 11:15. Her apartment building, 6 floors, pre-war brick, elevator that worked 3 days out of 5, received her back the way it always had, with the particular non-judgment of a place that had seen all versions of its residents and had no stake in any of them. She climbed to the 4th floor because the elevator was not one of its 3 days. She unlocked 2 deadbolts and a chain lock and went inside and stood in the dark of her own living room for approximately 90 seconds before she turned the lights on. She showered. She stood under hot water until the wine was fully gone from her skin and hair and the water ran clean, and then she stood under the water for another 8 minutes because she needed to and because there was nobody watching and she didn't have to hold her back straight in her own shower. She put on sweatpants and an old DePaul t-shirt, and she sat cross-legged on her bed and she opened her phone. The video had 420,000 views. It was 11:43 at night. She sat with that number and breathed. Her phone began ringing while she was looking at it. Not Margaret Osei. Too late for Margaret. It was Diane. I saw it, Diane said before Naomi could speak. Her voice had the particular texture of someone who had been sitting with something for an hour and had exhausted the outer layers and gotten down to the core of it. All of it, multiple angles, the wine, the man, the speech. A pause. Naomi, who is Roman Volkov? That's a long answer. I have time. I don't. She said it more gently than it sounded. Diane, I need to make some calls and I need to sleep, and I'll tell you everything tomorrow. What I need from you right now is to know you watched it and you understand that I'm okay. Are you okay? She looked around her apartment. Her apartment was exactly as she had left it. Rise program binders on the kitchen table, overdue library book on the coffee table. The photograph on the mantle of her mother at 35, standing in front of a house that no longer existed in a neighborhood that no longer existed, looking directly into the camera with the particular expression of a woman who understood that life was hard and had decided that understanding was not a reason to look away from it. I will be, Naomi said. That's not the same as okay. No, she agreed. It's better. She made 3 more calls. Her development director, who was awake and had seen the video and had already been contacted by 2 journalists and 1 major donor who wanted to increase their giving. Her board treasurer, who was cautious and methodical and needed to hear Naomi's voice stating that the organization's accounts were clean and their operations were sound before he could sleep. And a woman named Constance Wheeler, who ran the city's largest PR firm and who owed Naomi a favor from a zoning dispute 3 years ago, in which Naomi had been the only person willing to publicly support Constance's community center application. Constance picked up on the second ring. I've been watching the clock waiting for you to call, Constance said. 470,000 views as of 5 minutes ago. I need help managing what comes next, Naomi said. I need it fast and I need it quiet. And I need you to understand that there are parts of tonight I cannot talk about publicly, and you're going to have to work around those parts. How big are the parts you can't talk about? Significant. Constance was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then, okay, 7 a.m., my office. Bring coffee. Naomi said she would, and hung up and lay back on her bed and stared at the ceiling and let the full weight of the evening settle onto her chest where she could measure it properly. The ceiling had a water stain in the northeast corner that she had been meaning to report to the building manager for 7 months. She stared at the water stain. She thought about Victor's eyes finding her across the ballroom with the clinical precision of a man categorizing a new variable. She thought about Roman saying, I've confirmed it, specifically, as if the confirmation were a form of care and also a form of damage control simultaneously, and she was not sure yet which interpretation was more accurate. She thought about 500,000 views and what happened to a story that big when morning came and the news cycle found it, and journalists started pulling the thread. She set her alarm for 5:30. She did not sleep until 2. Monday arrived with the specific quality of Mondays that have been dreading themselves all weekend. gray, cold, Chicago October, asserting itself with the humorless efficiency of a city that had stopped performing mild weather sometime in the last decade and simply delivered what it had without apology. Naomi was in Constance's office at 7:02 with 2 coffees and the kind of focus that comes from 4.5 hours of sleep and the understanding that there was no version of today that permitted the luxury of being tired. The video had 1.2 million views. Constance had a whiteboard covered in notes she'd made between midnight and 6 a.m. She was 53, black, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and had the particular energy of a woman who had spent 3 decades managing other people's crises and had developed toward those crises the brisk, non-dramatic affection of a surgeon toward difficult procedures. "Good news first," Constance said without sitting down. "The narrative is clean. Woman of color, plus-size, nonprofit director, humiliated by white socialites at a charity gala. The video is unambiguous. The public response is overwhelmingly sympathetic. Major donors have already made contact. I have 3 interview requests from national outlets: Good Morning America, CBS Mornings, one podcast that has 8 million listeners. And the complicated news," Naomi said, "Roman Volkov." Constance looked at her over the reading glasses. "His name is in 6 of the 12 major news pieces that ran overnight. 5 of them describe him as a businessman. One describes him as a figure with reported ties to organized crime." She paused. "That one's from the Tribune." Naomi's coffee cup was warm in both hands. She held it. "If the Tribune is already there," Constance continued, "the others aren't far behind. Right now, your story and his story are parallel. They touched at the gala, and they haven't merged yet. The question is whether they merge." She took her glasses off. "Naomi, I need to know how close that contact was." "He put his jacket on my shoulders." "In front of 500 people and 11 cameras." "Yes." "And the conversation after?" Naomi looked at the whiteboard. "He gave me information I needed to have. I processed it. I made my own decisions. I gave a statement to a journalist. I left." Constance studied her. 20 years in crisis communications had given Constance the ability to hear the difference between what was said and what was present in the room alongside what was said. "Is he a threat to Rise?" Constance asked. "Direct. No architecture around it." "Not directly," Naomi said. "Not intentionally." She paused. "There are people connected to him who may try to use the association. I was told, I have reason to believe the funding that has touched Rise's donor networks is clean." She stopped. "I'm in the middle of verifying that independently." "How fast can you verify it?" "Today." "Then today you verify it. And tonight I have a statement ready that, if necessary, addresses the association honestly without opening doors we don't want open." Constance put her glasses back on and turned to the whiteboard. The interview request, Naomi's phone vibrated on the table between them. Unknown number, Chicago area code. She looked at it. "You need to take that?" Constance asked. "I don't know yet." She picked it up. "Brooks." A pause. Then a voice that was not Victor and not Roman and not anyone she recognized. Younger, male, with an accent she couldn't immediately place. "Ms. Brooks, my name is Daniel Reyes. I'm a federal agent with the Financial Crimes Division. I'd like to speak with you today about Roman Volkov." Another pause, precisely long enough. "At your convenience, of course." The word convenience landed with the particular weight of words deployed ironically by people in positions that made convenience irrelevant. Naomi did not change her breathing. She did not look at Constance. She kept her voice level and her eyes on the whiteboard, and she said, "I'll have my attorney contact you." She hung up. Constance was looking at her. "We need an attorney," Naomi said. "I have 3 on speed dial." "The best one. Today." She set the phone face down on the table. "The story just got more complicated." Constance pulled her own phone out. "How much more complicated?" "Federal complicated." Constance dialed without blinking. This was why Naomi had called her. The attorney's name was Claire Sung. She was at Constance's office by 9:15, and she was the kind of attorney who made you feel, immediately upon meeting her, that the situation you were in was a situation she had already considered from 17 angles and found manageable, which was either accurate or the most valuable possible performance. She listened to everything Naomi told her. All of it. including the parts about Victor and the organization and the accounts and the word exposure. Naomi had decided, somewhere between 7 and 9 that morning, that the only way through this was full information in the hands of the right people, and Claire Sung was the right people. Claire made notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting so small it was nearly illegible. When Naomi finished, Claire looked at her notes for a moment, then looked up. "You have not received money from Volkov or any entity he controls." "Not to my knowledge. He told me the funding is clean. I need to verify that independently." "I'll have a forensic accountant begin that process today." Claire made a note. "You spoke to Volkov at the gala?" "Yes." "Did he ask you to do anything, carry anything, meet anyone, make any representation on his behalf?" "No." "Did he give you anything? Documents, materials, any physical item?" Naomi thought about the jacket. "His jacket, for 10 minutes. I gave it back." Claire wrote something. "The federal agent who called, financial crimes. That's not organized crime task force, not violent crimes. Financial crimes means they're looking at money movement, not at you for association with criminal enterprise." She paused. "That's both better and more complicated. Better because your exposure is lower. More complicated because if they're looking at money movement and your donor networks have touched Volkov-adjacent accounts, the audit process becomes involved." "How involved?" "Uncomfortable but survivable, if the money is what Volkov says it is." Claire looked at her. "The question I need you to answer honestly is this. Is there anything in Rise's financial history that you are uncertain about? Anything at all?" Naomi met her eyes. "No." Claire nodded once. "Then we're in a manageable position." She clicked her pen. "I need to make 3 calls. Give me an hour." She left the room. Constance poured more coffee. The whiteboard waited. Naomi's phone buzzed. Text message, blocked number. 3 words. "Monday went wrong." Her stomach dropped. She typed back. "How wrong?" 30 seconds. Then, "Victor has something. Not accounts. Something else. I need to see you today." She looked at the message. She looked at the closed door where Claire Sung was making 3 calls that were supposed to make this manageable. She typed, "Where?" A location came back. "Warehouse District, South Side. 3 p.m. She looked at the address. She knew that neighborhood. She'd run a Rise satellite program 2 blocks from there for 8 months before the lease fell through. She knew which streets had cameras and which didn't. Constance was watching her face. "It's Roman," Naomi said. "What does he want?" "A meeting. South Side, 3 o'clock. Constance put her coffee down. "Naomi, I know. You have a federal agent who called you this morning. You have an attorney in the next room. You have 1.2 million people who watched a video of you last night and are currently on your side." Her voice was careful, not theatrical. "Whatever Roman Volkov's Monday problem is, it is not your problem." Naomi looked at the text message. "Victor has something," she said, repeating it aloud. "Not accounts. Something else." She looked up. "He's not asking me to fix his Monday problem, Constance. He's telling me that whatever Victor found is something that changes what I need to know. Or he's pulling you in closer." "Yes," she said. "That's also possible." The door opened, and Claire Sung came back in with her legal pad and her illegible handwriting and the expression of someone who had just finished 3 phone calls that had confirmed something. "I spoke with a contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office," Claire said, without preamble. "Daniel Reyes is real. The financial crimes investigation into Volkov's Chicago accounts has been active for 14 months. She paused. "Ms. Brooks, your name has been in their files for 6 of those months. Not as a subject. As a... The term they used was proximate civilian. 6 months. Roman had said he'd known who she was for 8 months. The calculation was automatic and horrible. 2 months between when Roman began watching her and when federal investigators began including her name in a file. 2 months in which something Roman did or said or arranged had caused the government to look in her direction. Proximate civilian, Naomi repeated. "It means they know you exist and they're watching to see what you do," Claire said. Right now you have done nothing actionable. Tonight that remains true if you speak to no one connected to Volkov without me present, and you do not meet. I have a meeting request, Naomi said. 3 p.m. Roman Volkov, South Side. The room was quiet. Claire said, "No." Constance said nothing. Naomi looked at the text on her phone. Victor has something. Not accounts. Something else. She thought about Keisha Morrison and her 5-minute presentation on urban agriculture. She thought about 3,000 girls. She thought about federal files and proximate civilians and 14 months of investigation and the 2 cars outside the Riverside Plaza Hotel with their engines running. She thought about Roman's voice saying, "The money is clean. I've confirmed it specifically." She thought, "He confirmed it before he told me. He went looking for the answer before I knew I needed the question." She said, "If I don't go to this meeting and Victor has something that surfaces this week, something that connects Rise to Volkov's world in a way that looks intentional, what does that do to the organization?" Claire started to answer and then stopped. She was an honest attorney. She worked with what was true. "It depends on what Victor has," she said, "which I won't know unless I go. Or unless the federal investigation surfaces it on its own timeline. And if their timeline is slower than Victor's timeline, Naomi," Claire's voice was even, "I need to be clear. If you walk into a meeting with Roman Volkov today, knowing that a federal investigation is active, the calculation of your status in that investigation changes. From proximate civilian to what?" Claire looked at her. "It depends on what's said in the room." The room held that answer for a moment. Naomi's phone buzzed again. Same blocked number. This time, not a text. A photograph. She opened it. It was a document. Headed paper. A funding agreement between a private trust and a non-profit organization. The non-profit's name was Rise Up. The trust's name was one she'd never seen before. Cornerstone Civic Partners, LLC. The date on the agreement was 14 months ago. The signature on behalf of Rise was hers. She had never signed this document. She had never heard of Cornerstone Civic Partners, LLC. She turned the phone so that Claire Sung could see the screen, and she watched Claire's expression process the image. And she watched the manageable position Claire had described 20 minutes ago become something that the document on the phone screen had her signature on it. Naomi knew her own signature the way she knew the sound of her own voice. Not because she studied it, but because it was hers, had been hers since she was 9 years old, practicing it on the back of a school notebook. The particular lean of the N, the way the B in Brooks closed tighter at the top than the bottom. She had signed thousands of documents in 4 years of running Rise. Grant applications, lease agreements, vendor contracts, donor acknowledgement letters, employment paperwork, the lease on the satellite office that fell through, the amendment to that lease, the termination of that lease. She had never signed anything for Cornerstone Civic Partners, LLC. The signature on the screen was hers anyway. Claire Sung looked at the image for 11 seconds. Naomi counted. Then Claire said, "Don't respond to that message." Her voice had changed. Not dramatically, not with alarm, but with the specific recalibration of a professional who has just encountered the thing that makes the situation categorically different from what it was 3 minutes ago. Don't respond, don't delete, don't forward. Screenshot it to a separate device if you have one. This phone is now potential evidence, and I need you to treat it accordingly. "Someone forged my signature on a funding agreement," Naomi said. She said it flatly, because if she said it any other way, she was going to have to feel it, and she was not ready to feel it yet. There was too much that needed doing before she could afford to feel it. "Yes," Claire said. 14 months ago. That's what the document shows. Which means whoever created this document created it when the federal investigation was already 6 months old. Naomi looked at Claire. Which means someone built a paper trail connecting me to Volkov's financial network, and they built it while federal agents were already watching. The room was very quiet. Constance said, "Victor." Naomi thought about Victor's eyes finding her across the ballroom. She thought about the clinical precision of that assessment. She thought about Roman's text. Victor has something. Not accounts, something else. She thought about the 14-month timeline and the 8-month timeline, and the 2-month gap between them and what could have happened in that gap that would give Victor the leverage to manufacture a document and sit on it for over a year waiting for the right moment to use it. She thought about Roman knowing she existed before federal investigators put her name in a file. She thought about all the things she still didn't know. She looked at Claire. "I need to make a phone call." "Naomi," not to Roman. She was already standing. "To Daniel Reyes." Claire blinked. "The federal agent?" "He called me this morning. He has my number. That means he's been waiting for me to be ready to talk." She looked at Claire. "I'm ready, but I'm going to him with this document, and I'm going with you in the room, and I'm going before 3 o'clock because whatever Victor's plan is for that meeting, whatever Roman is expecting or not expecting, I am not going to sit in a warehouse on the south side while a federal investigation and a forged document and a man I don't fully trust are all converging on the same afternoon." Claire looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "That's the right call." "I know it is," Naomi said. She said it without satisfaction. It was the right call, the way amputation is the right call. Correct, necessary, and something you don't feel good about. She went to the window while Claire made the call. Chicago was doing its October thing outside. Low clouds, the lake wind finding every gap in the city's geometry. People on the street below moving with the particular purposefulness of people who had accepted the cold as the baseline condition and were operating within it rather than against it. She thought about her mother at 35 in the photograph on the mantel, looking directly into the camera, not blinking. Daniel Reyes agreed to meet at 2 o'clock. Federal Building, downtown. Claire would be present. Naomi would bring the phone. They had 4 hours. She spent them at Constance's conference table with Claire on one side and Constance on the other, and a forensic accountant named Paul Adeyemi, who Constance called in from a firm she worked with, sitting across from her with a laptop and a direct connection to Rise's accounting software. Paul was 37, meticulous in the specific way that accountants who have testified in federal proceedings become meticulous. Every number cross-referenced, every discrepancy noted, every clean result documented as clean with a timestamp and a source. By 12:30, Paul had been through 4 years of Rise's financials. He looked up from his laptop with the expression of a man delivering a medical result he'd already known for an hour. "Your organization's accounts are clean," he said. "Every dollar that came in has a documented source. Every dollar that went out has a documented purpose and a recipient. No gaps, no unexplained transfers, no dormant accounts, no instruments I can't trace." He paused. "Cornerstone Civic Partners does not appear anywhere in Rise's financial history. Not as a donor, not as a vendor, not as a related entity, not as a name that appears in any correspondence in your email server." Another pause. "The document on your phone is not reflected in any actual financial transaction that your organization conducted." Naomi let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest since 9 a.m. "It's a fabrication," Claire said. "Not a question." "The document is fabricated," Paul said carefully. "Whether the signature is genuine or forged, I can't determine. That's a document examiner's work. What I can tell you is that the transaction it describes never happened." Naomi said, "Thank you." She meant it in a way that went below the surface of the words. At 1:45, Claire's car took them downtown. Naomi sat in the back and watched the city and did not look at her phone. At some point in the preceding 4 hours, she had made a decision she hadn't announced, had made it so quietly that it was already made before she noticed it happening, about what she was going to do about Roman's 3 o'clock request. She was not going. She was going to the federal building at 2 o'clock, and she was going to tell Daniel Reyes everything she knew, including the document, including Victor, including the text messages. And she was going to let the people whose job it was to handle this kind of situation handle this kind of situation. She was a nonprofit director. That was what she was. That was what she was going to remain. The federal building was exactly what federal buildings are: authoritative, functional, designed to communicate permanence in a way that had nothing to do with warmth. Daniel Reyes met them in a conference room on the 6th floor. He was younger than she'd expected from his voice. Early 40s, Latino, with a runner's build and the particular quality of attention of someone who had learned to listen more than he spoke in professional settings, because the listening was where the information was. He thanked her for coming. He said it like he meant it. She put her phone on the table, and she told him everything. It took 55 minutes. Claire intervened 3 times, once to clarify a legal boundary, once to object to a line of questioning she found overreaching, once to ask for a water break that Naomi used to regroup after the part about Victor saying the woman becomes a complication, because saying it aloud in a federal conference room with institutional lighting and a recording device on the table made it real in a way that the adrenaline of the preceding 16 hours had kept slightly at bay. Reyes listened. He made notes. He did not perform surprise at any point, which told her that most of what she was saying was information that intersected with things he already knew, which meant the investigation was further along than Victor, and possibly Roman, understood. When she finished, Reyes was quiet for a moment. "The document you received," he said. "The forged signature. I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand this is not an accusation. It's a question I have to ask for the integrity of the record." He looked at her directly. "Is there any possibility, any scenario in which you signed a document for an entity called Cornerstone Civic Partners and subsequently forgot or chose not to recall that signing?" "No," she said. "You're certain?" "I am certain of every document I have ever signed on behalf of Rise. I have been certain of that since the day I incorporated because I learned early that the only thing standing between my organization and dissolution was the integrity of our paperwork. I do not sign things I don't read, and I do not sign things I don't understand, and I have never heard the name Cornerstone Civic Partners until this morning." Reyes nodded, made a note. "The document was sent from a blocked number." "Yes." "We'll trace it." He said it with the flat confidence of someone for whom tracing blocked numbers was not a particularly interesting technical challenge. "Ms. Brooks, I want to be honest with you about something." She waited. "Your name has been in our file for 6 months," he said. "You were never a subject. You were a peripheral contact, someone who appeared in Volkov's behavioral patterns in a way that suggested significance without suggesting complicity. We've been monitoring that relationship because—" He stopped himself, chose his next words. "Because individuals in Volkov's position sometimes use proximity to legitimate organizations as cover. We needed to understand whether that was what was happening here." "And what did you conclude?" she said. "We concluded that Volkov's interest in you was personal," Reyes said, "not operational, which made it, from an investigative standpoint, less immediately relevant." He paused. "The forged document changes that calculus. Someone in Volkov's network, or in Viktor Marchenko's network, which is distinct, has tried to create a false paper trail that implicates your organization. That's obstruction, fraud, and an attempt to manufacture leverage. It's also, from our perspective, useful, because it tells us what Viktor Marchenko is afraid of." "What is he afraid of?" Claire said. "That Volkov completes his separation from the European structure," Reyes said. "If Volkov goes independent, fully independent, which our intelligence suggests he's been building toward for 18 months, the European organization loses its Chicago revenue. That's a significant loss. Victor was sent here to stop it." He looked at Naomi. "You became useful to Victor the moment Volkov made his interest in you public. A forged document connecting you to Volkov's financial network gives Victor 2 options. He can use it to pressure Volkov directly, or he can surface it to us and use the federal investigation as a weapon to destabilize Volkov's operations here." Naomi sat with that for a moment. "He was going to show it to Roman at the 3 o'clock meeting," she said. "That's our read. And if Roman didn't comply with whatever Victor wanted, Victor surfaces it to us. We open a thread on your organization. It slows Volkov's plans while he manages the fallout, and it costs him something he cares about protecting." Reyes paused. "You." The word landed in the room and stayed there. Claire said, "What's the status of the 3 o'clock meeting?" "As of an hour ago, it's still scheduled." Reyes looked at his notes. "Volkov will be there. Victor's people will be there." He looked up. "We'll also be there, in a capacity that Victor will not anticipate." Naomi looked at him. "You've been planning to move on this." "The document you brought us this morning accelerated our timeline, Musk," he said. "The forgery is actionable. Victor creating fraudulent financial instruments to obstruct a federal investigation and coerce a civilian is a set of charges that doesn't require us to wait for the larger case to be ready. He looked at her. You gave us the piece we needed. She thought about Roman's text. Monday went wrong. She thought about him sitting in that warehouse at 3 o'clock, expecting Victor to walk in with leverage, and not knowing that the leverage had already been handed to people who would use it differently than Victor intended. She thought about whether Roman knew about the forgery, whether he'd sent her the document, or whether Victor had sent it in Roman's name as a manipulation, using Roman's block number to get her to the warehouse where Victor's position would be stronger. She looked at Reyes. The text I received this morning, the blocked number. Was it Roman's phone? Reyes glanced at his notes. We're still confirming that. Tell me when you know. He looked at her. Then he nodded. She left the federal building at 3:47. The 3 o'clock meeting was already in federal hands by then. She didn't know the details, wouldn't know them until much later. And the details, when she eventually learned them, were both more complicated and more mundane than she'd imagined. The way most things that happen in real life are more complicated and more mundane than the version your imagination constructs. What she knew, standing on the sidewalk outside the federal building with Claire beside her, and the October wind finding the back of her neck, was that the thing she'd been standing in the middle of since the moment Genevieve Holloway raised a wine glass was now in the hands of people equipped to handle it, and she had put it there by walking into a building and telling the truth about what she knew. It was not dramatic. It was the least dramatic possible conclusion to the most dramatic 16 hours of her life. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed cold air and felt the particular exhaustion that comes after sustained fear has been permitted to release. Not relief exactly, but the body's version of an all-clear signal, the unwinding of every muscle that had been holding since 11 o'clock the previous night. Claire said, Go home. Sleep. Call me tomorrow morning. What happens next? Naomi said. That depends on a lot of things outside your control, Claire said. What you can control is Rise. Your staff, your programs, your donors. The forensic accounting is clean. The video has given you a platform you didn't have yesterday. The story people are following is your story. The nonprofit director, the ballroom, the wine. Keep it that way. Don't comment on Volkov. Don't comment on investigations. Let the work speak. Naomi nodded. And Naomi, Claire's voice shifted just slightly. Not warmer exactly, but less professional, which amounted to the same thing. What you did this morning took nerve. Coming in here, telling Reyes everything. Most people in your position would have lawyered up into silence and hoped it went away. She paused. You didn't. Silence wasn't going to protect my girls, Naomi said. Claire looked at her for a moment. Then she said, No, it wasn't. She went home. She slept for 11 hours. When she woke, it was Tuesday morning and there were 47 text messages and her phone had stopped being able to receive calls because the voicemail was full and the video had 4.3 million views and 3 national morning shows had sent formal interview requests through Rise's website, contact form, because they could no longer reach her directly. She lay in bed and looked at the ceiling and at the water stain in the northeast corner, and she did not reach for the phone immediately. She gave herself 5 minutes of just being a person in her own bed, in her own apartment, in her own life before the day made its demands. Then she got up. She made coffee. She stood at her kitchen window with the mug and looked at the neighborhood, but not her childhood neighborhood. This one was different, farther north, quieter, but it had the same quality that Chicago neighborhoods had of being specific and inhabited, of belonging to the people who lived in them rather than to any abstract idea of what they should be. She thought about Roman. She had not heard from him since the text message Monday morning. She did not know what the 3 o'clock meeting had produced, or what federal agents' unanticipated presence had meant for the conversation between Roman and Victor, or what came next in a situation where someone was 18 months into separating from an organization that did not want to be separated from. She did not know whether the blocked number had been Roman's phone or Victor's, and she was not sure, sitting in her kitchen on Tuesday morning, that knowing would change what she thought about it. She thought about what he'd said in the SUV. I've been looking for a way to exist in your proximity that didn't involve the parts of my life that would make that proximity something you'd reject. She thought, there is no version of those parts that doesn't involve that rejection. She thought, he probably knows that. She thought, he probably knew it when he said it. There was a knock on her door at 9:15. She was not expecting anyone. She looked through the peephole and saw a man she didn't recognize, older, gray-coated, holding something. She didn't open the door. "Miss Brooks," the man said from the hallway. "My name is Arthur Gaines. I'm with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Daniel Reyes asked me to deliver something." A pause. "He said you'd want to know how yesterday ended." She opened the door. Arthur Gaines was 60, had the build of someone who'd been an athlete in a previous chapter, and held a sealed envelope. He handed it to her without coming inside, which she appreciated. "Viktor Marchenko was taken into federal custody at 3:42 yesterday afternoon," Gaines said. "The charges include conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, and creation of fraudulent financial instruments." He paused. "Additional charges related to his organization's activities may follow." Naomi held the envelope. "The document on your phone has been confirmed as a forgery," Gaines continued. "Forensic document examination completed last night. Your signature was digitally replicated from a genuine document in Rise's public grant filings." He looked at her steadily. "There is no federal interest in your organization, Ms. Brooks. That's the official position, and it's accurate." She breathed. "The envelope," he said, "is from Reyes. Background information on Cornerstone Civic Partners, who created it, when, under whose direction. He thought you deserved to know the full picture." He paused. "It's not required reading, but it answers some questions." He left. She stood at the kitchen table and looked at the sealed envelope for a long time before she opened it. Cornerstone Civic Partners, LLC, had been created 11 months ago. The registered agent was a shell corporation with addresses in 3 states. The beneficial owner, the actual human being behind the entity, was a man named Gregor Vasile, who worked for Viktor Marchenko and had been on the U.S. Attorney's radar for 4 years for various financial crimes in a case that was now, as of yesterday afternoon, significantly more resolved. The forgery had been created 7 months ago. It had been sitting in Viktor's inventory as a contingency, a piece of manufactured evidence to be deployed when and if Roman Volkov's relationship with Naomi Brooks became operationally significant. Viktor had waited. The gala had given him the trigger. He had sent the document to Roman's phone, not from Roman's phone, the night of the gala, with the intent of creating the impression that Roman had sent it to lure Naomi to the warehouse, which would have given Viktor the ability to claim that Roman was manipulating a civilian, which would have been an additional charge in the federal investigation. It had not worked because Naomi had gone to the federal building instead of the warehouse. She put the papers down. She put both palms flat on the kitchen table and she looked at them. Her hands, which had built something from nothing, which had signed thousands of documents and shaken thousands of hands, and held the shoulders of young women who were learning for the first time that their lives were navigable. And she let herself feel, for the first time since Sunday night, the full weight of how close it had come. Not to disaster, to something more specific, to having the thing she'd built used against her by people who had never given a single thought to the 3,000 names attached to it, to being a variable in someone else's equation, to disappearing into someone else's story. She had not disappeared. She pressed her palms flat and she breathed and she did not look away from what it had cost. Then she straightened up and she picked up her phone and she called Diane. "I'm okay," she said, before Diane could ask. "I know," Diane said. "I watched the 4 a.m. news. Viktor, whoever got arrested. They're connecting it to the gala footage." A pause. "I don't understand most of what I'm watching, but I understand that you're on the right side of it." "I tried to be," Naomi said. "Did you sleep?" 11 hours. "Good." Diane's voice had the warmth of someone who had been holding sustained concern since Sunday evening and was now, carefully, releasing it. "What do you need today?" "I need to go to work," Naomi said. "I need to sit in the Rise office and look at the program schedules and talk to my staff and drink bad coffee from the machine in the break room that nobody ever cleans properly." "That sounds exactly right," Diane said. She was at the office by 11. Her staff, 7 full-time people and 4 part-time. People who had built this thing alongside her with the same combination of conviction and stubbornness and refusal to accept that the resources available to them were the resources available to them, looked at her when she walked in with the expressions of people who had watched a video 4 million times and then waited for the actual person to arrive and confirm that the video's version of her was the real one. She sat with each of them individually. She told them what she could tell them. She told them the accounts were clean, showed them Paul Adeyemi's forensic report, and she told them the federal interest in Rise was formally closed, and she told them the forgery had been traced to Viktor Marchenko's network and was being handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office. She did not tell them about Roman. That part was hers. It was not operational, not organizational, not anyone's business but her own, and she was going to sit with it privately until she understood what she actually thought, which might take a while. Roman texted her at 2:15 on Tuesday afternoon, not from a blocked number, from a number she didn't recognize but which arrived with his name in the message, as if to establish immediately what the context was. The message was 7 words. Victor is in custody. Are you safe? She looked at the message for a long time. She typed back, yes. Are you? 3 minutes. Then, working on it. She understood that to mean, not entirely, not yet, but in the direction of it. She understood that the 18-month process of separation he'd described was now accelerated in ways that were probably both better and worse than he'd planned, and that the next months for him would involve a complexity she was not equipped to navigate alongside him, and was not, if she was being honest with herself, sure she wanted to. She typed, I need time. His response came in 40 seconds. I know. Take it. And then, after a pause that she counted at a full minute and 12 seconds, what you did Monday. Going to Reyes. I didn't plan that. I didn't ask you to do that. Another pause. It was the right thing. I want you to know I understand that, even though it changed things for me significantly. She looked at that last part. Changed things for me significantly. She translated it the way she'd learned to translate his economy of language, the compression of large things into small phrases because he'd spent years in environments where elaboration was a liability. She typed, Did you send me the document? His answer came immediately. No. That was Victor. He used my number as a relay. I found out what he'd sent when Dmitri traced the signal at 7 a.m. Monday. A pause. I should have warned you faster. I'm sorry. She held the phone and read the apology, and she thought about all the ways that apology was both sufficient and insufficient simultaneously, the way most apologies for things that actually mattered were. She typed, I know. And then after a moment, I believe you. It was true. She believed him. She had held that question at arm's length for 36 hours, because believing him had felt like a risk she couldn't afford while the situation was still live and she was still in the middle of it. Now the situation was resolved enough to afford the truth. She believed him. That didn't mean she knew what to do with him. She put the phone face down on her desk, and she pulled up Rise's program calendar for the following week, and she started making notes. Thursday afternoon, Keisha Morrison had been selected to present at the organization's monthly showcase, a 30-minute presentation in front of donors and community partners on the urban agriculture initiative she'd been building since September. Naomi had promised to be there. She was going to be there. Everything else, Roman and Victor and federal investigations and 4.3 million views and the document with the forged signature, all of it would still be there afterward. The world was not going to run out of complications while she spent 90 minutes watching a 14-year-old girl from the South Side stand in front of a room of adults and explain something she'd built and understood completely. On Thursday afternoon, Naomi sat in the third row of Rise's community room. Fluorescent lights, folding chairs, a projector borrowed from the school 2 blocks over. And she watched Keisha Morrison walk to the front of the room with her handwritten note cards and her too big blazer borrowed from an older sister and the particular expression of someone who is afraid and is not letting the fear be in charge. Keisha looked at her notes. Then she looked up at the room. She didn't look at her notes again for 27 minutes. Naomi sat in the third row and felt something settle in her chest. Not resolution exactly. Not the clean click of a thing concluding, but the other thing. The one that doesn't have a clean name. The ongoing confirmation that you are in the right place, doing the right work, and that the cost of being here, whatever it has been and whatever it will be, is the correct cost to pay. The donors in the room applauded for a long time when Keisha finished. Naomi was the last to stop. Afterward, when the folding chairs were being stacked and the borrowed projector was being wheeled back out, and Keisha was in the corner with three of her peers examining her own note cards with the expression of someone reviewing a document they couldn't entirely believe they'd produced, Naomi stood at the room's single window and watched the street outside. Southside Chicago, October. Low clouds, a kid on a bicycle, a woman walking a dog that was testing the full extension of its leash in the direction of something interesting, the ordinary, continuous life of a neighborhood being lived. Her phone was in her pocket. She did not take it out. She had a call with Claire Sung at 4 o'clock. She had an interview request to respond to. She'd decided to accept one. The podcast. Because 8 million listeners was a platform she could use, and because Constance had helped her understand that the story being told about Sunday night was still being shaped, and she was the only one who could shape it from the inside. She had a meeting with her development director about the donor contacts that had come in since the video, and those conversations needed to happen carefully because growth that comes from a viral moment was a different kind of growth than growth that came from sustained work, and the two needed to be managed differently. She had things to do. She had always had things to do. The city outside the window went on doing what it did. Naomi Brooks stood at the window of the organization she'd built from nothing and breathed, and the breath went in clean and came out even, and the water stain on the ceiling of her apartment was still there waiting for her to deal with it, and Viktor Marchenko was in federal custody, and Roman Volkov was somewhere in the city working on it, and 4.3 million people had watched 30 seconds of video that showed a woman keeping her back straight while someone tried to make her feel like she didn't belong in the room. She had spent 28 years being told in various languages by various methods that certain rooms were not for her. She had built, over the course of those 28 years, a different kind of room. Not a room you were born into or bought your way into or married your way into, but a room you earned entry to by showing up and doing the work and refusing, when the wine hit your neck and the crowd went silent and the security guard's hand closed around your arm to apologize for things you hadn't done. She had kept her back straight. She was still keeping it. That, in the end, was not a small thing. She turned from the window when she heard Keisha call her name. "Ms. Brooks." Keisha was holding her note cards, and her expression had moved from disbelief into something more settled, something that was going to become, in time, a piece of how she understood herself. "Did I do okay?" Naomi looked at her. "You did better than okay," she said. Keisha nodded, absorbing this. Then she said, "Are you coming next week? For the panel?" "I'll be here," Naomi said. She said it the way she said all things she was certain of, without decoration, without emphasis, as plain fact. She would be here next week, and the week after, and the week after that, doing the work the way she had always done it, with the specific, unglamorous persistence of a woman who had decided a long time ago that the world's resistance to her presence was not a final verdict, and who had spent every day since making sure the girls who came after her would enter their own difficult rooms with something she had not had enough of at 14, evidence that it was possible to stay. Outside the window, the city continued. Inside the room, Keisha Morrison put her note cards in her pocket. Naomi Brooks picked up her bag and walked toward the door and the day's remaining work, and the sound of her footsteps on the linoleum floor was steady and unhurried and entirely her own. End.